So this is part 2 of chapter 24, Foner's Affluent Society, where we'll be looking at some of the critics in the conformity of the 50s that we covered last class, the beginnings of the Civil Rights Movement, and then the early 60s and the controversies that will ensue afterwards. So, in the early 50s, there was increasing criticism of what American society had become because of its conformity. There was resentment. The Cold War had stifled real freedom of speech. There was a feeling that consumption had been the dominant culture, and it had made Americans complacent about more important political issues. Some of the people that spoke out were Hans Morgenthau, who warned of new accumulations of corporate power; David Reisman, who wrote The Lonely Crowd and lamented the conformity of American society, as well as the unity caused by commodity culture, which really stifled any real debate. And most importantly, John Kenneth Galbraith's The Affluent Society. Here he lamented the lack of money invested in education and public services, and so much money being invested in the production of consumer goods. He also lamented the lack of education for women who were confined in the suburbs, and the ideal of being mothers and housewives, whether they wanted to or not. Another major development in the 1950s against the culture of conformity were what's known as the cultural rebels. Because of the baby boom that was taking place during and after World War II, there was a huge number of teenagers in the 1950s that came of age, many of whom were alienated from the conformist culture of their parents. The market catered to this youthful alienation and rebellion. And so you have the emergence of Elvis Presley, and there's a video here on the screen that you can click on or copy and paste, in this case, whose behavior on stage was seen as sexually provocative, as well as his music. James Dean, again, there's another clip here that you can follow, in the movie Rebel Without a Cause, that showed an aimless, rebellious youth seemingly out of place in his family's life. This was also the period of the emergence of the magazine Playboy that challenged the family ideal of the 1950s. And we also see here the beginning of a strong gay and lesbian subculture in the major cities. On the literary side, a movement known as the Beats emerged in San Francisco and New York. In their work, you find themes of the rejection of materialism, conformity, and Cold War militarization. Their work also embraced spontaneity, immediate pleasure, and sexual experimentation. The key works of this literary group were Jack Kerouac's book On the Road, that was really a story of pure wandering and exploration for its own sake, without any particular goal, but just to be alive. Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl, which rejected consumerism, militarism, and homophobia. Both of these works were initially branded as obscene. Howell's book was initially branded as obscene, but the court overturned this ban. Another major development in the middle to late 50s was the emergence of the Civil Rights Movement. This was the most significant challenge to the complacency of the 1950s. Why did it emerge? Well, the result of World War II really challenged the racial system in America. World War II was about attacking Nazi racism, and thus you couldn't allow racism to continue at home if you fought against it overseas. Moreover, the armed services had been desegregated. There was a tremendous migration of blacks to the north, where they were better able to organize and became strong voting blocs for the Democratic Party. The black churches in the South were also strong centers of organization. There was also the Cold War. There's an increasing discrepancy between the perception of America being the home of the free, and yet its consistent racism and segregation. The Civil Rights Movement was also given a boost by the decolonization efforts overseas, where the plight of blacks struggling against white supremacy overseas paralleled that happening at home. And of course, there was the real, persistent segregation and inequality still going on in America. There was Jim Crow in the South, legal segregation, and then in the North, there was, in fact, segregation because of the restrictive practices of banks and various other institutions that kept whites and blacks separate. The assault on segregation began legally. The League of United Latin American Citizens challenged segregation in the courts in the Southwest. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People further challenged desegregation in the courts. They were now challenging the very basis of segregation, which was the idea of keeping people separate if you provide equal services. Their claim was, separate never leads to equality. The key steps in the legal assault against segregation were, for instance, the 1946 case brought by Lulac of Mendez v. Westminster in California, which ordered the desegregation of schools in California. In 1950, the NAACP brought case against the University of Texas Law School, which the U.S. Supreme Court eventually forced to desegregate. But the biggest case was the 54 case, Brown v. Board of Education. Here, the NAACP decided to attack the whole notion of separate but equal. They emphasized that separation caused stigmatization and the subversion of black self-esteem. They won, and the court ordered the desegregation of schools. It made the 14th Amendment the basis of equality across the country. It also marked the beginning of the activist era of the Warren Court, wherein numerous laws were upheld or passed which guaranteed civil liberties. There were limits to the Brown v. Board of Education case. It certainly did not outlaw all segregation, and it did not outlaw de facto segregation in the North, which, as I mentioned, was a consequence of unfair lending practices that kept housing segregated. The biggest boost forward was the 1955 Montgomery Rosa Parks incident, which led to the Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks was an activist in Alabama, and on December 1st, 1955, she had refused to give up her seat to whites on the bus, where she was legally supposed to. She was arrested, and from that point forward, a year-long black boycott of segregated buses commenced in Montgomery. In 1956, the Supreme Court ruled against segregation in public transportation. This was a huge win. Its significance was manifold. It launched the nonviolent Southern Crusade for racial justice. It achieved attention and support around the country. It embarrassingly highlighted the racial tensions in America to the outside world, and it marked the emergence of Martin Luther King as a national symbol. King was incredibly successful. Part of the reason were the themes of his movement, which merged the black cause with the experience of those in the rest of the nation struggling for freedom and equality. He was able to reach both blacks and whites, and his philosophy was successful because he preached nonviolence, civil disobedience, Christian love, and forgiveness. And of course, he also connected the struggles of African Americans here at home with non-whites overseas. Southerners resisted the slow-growing strength of the civil rights movement with what's known as massive resistance. They issued a Southern Manifesto. They demanded legal resistance to desegregation. The Southern states passed anti-desegregation laws meant to overturn what the federal Supreme Court was doing. They were encouraging the ignoring desegregation laws. Some states banned the NAACP, and some schools were simply closed instead of desegregating them. This all came to a head in Little Rock, Arkansas, when Governor Orville Faubus ignored a court-ordered integration of a high school in Little Rock. This was in flagrant violation of the law, and he used National Guard troops to enforce this continued segregation. President Eisenhower was finally forced to send in federal troops in order to enforce the desegregation of this high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Finally, we come to the end of the 60s, where you see the beginning of a new era, and this was most clearly seen in the election of 1960 between the Republican nominee Richard Nixon, who was the vice president under Eisenhower, and the Democratic nominee John F. Kennedy. He symbolized a new era. He was the youngest major party nominee, a senator from Massachusetts. He was its first Catholic. He was incredibly handsome, glamorous, along with his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, who symbolized a new period, a new time of youth and energy over the conformity and conservative nature of the 50s. He won partly because of his aesthetic appeal, and partly because of his strong position on national defense and how he argued the Republicans had led to a missile gap between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Another reason why he was so incredibly successful was his performance in the first ever live presidential debates between him and Nixon. Though on the radio people believed that Nixon won because of his substance, on TV, Nixon looked tired, bothered, distracted, and profusely perspired, whereas Kennedy looked confident and strong. Kennedy beat Nixon by just 120,000 popular votes, possibly with the help of corrupt election practices in Chicago. This map shows how close the election was. The electoral vote shows Kennedy with 303 votes over 219 for Nixon. But in the popular vote, as you can see, the country was evenly divided. And though the popular vote does not have any legal bearing on the election of the president, it does show that in terms of political legitimacy, Kennedy barely won half of the country. When Eisenhower stepped down, he gave a final address to the nation, and he warned that America had created a military-industrial complex. Its enlarged defense industry and its political allies were threatening American liberties. It was especially pushing America into more and more wars, such as Vietnam, which was going to cause future problems. Other problems on the horizon for the 1960s were things like developing environmental conflicts. All the cars created to get people to the new suburbs were creating smog. Increasing global warming was a consequence from the new air conditioners as suburbs expanded in the south and the southwest. Increasing chemical usage in farming was becoming a problem, as this was poisoning both its workers and consumers. Socially, women were beginning to rebel against suburban confinement. Blacks were becoming increasingly impatient with the slow pace of change. The 60s were now clearly here.